Welcome. Thank you for attending. This is the leadership session on governance, risk, and compliance. I'm Chad Wolf, Vice President of Security for AWS. And this is Hart. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Hart Rossman, Director of Security and Infrastructure in AWS.
Great. Today, we're talking about governance in the general introduction, really, to the governance, risk, and compliance track, even though the track is pretty much almost over, seeing how there's only a half day left of the conference. But we want to talk a little bit about governance in general and talk about what that means today. We'll discuss a little bit about automated reasoning and do some interview. I have a couple other people coming on stage, so hopefully it'll be interesting to you guys. So 10 years ago, what was governance? I think if you really think back at what the governance, risk, and compliance team in your organizations was, 10 years ago, who were they? Probably the kind of person who interjects themselves during an audit or does some documentation on the side that maybe nobody really reads, or creates those big manuals that sit on your shelf and collect dust. That's kind of, 10 years ago, that's what the governance, risk, and compliance function was. The change that's happening now in the last couple of years is we're seeing more and more companies go with more of integrated governance models. So the same with integrated security models. They're putting the governance functions, the functions whereby the controls and the security requirements and everything that needs to happen to make sure you're secure and compliant are more integrated in the entirety of the process, and from the design phase all the way through to operations. The auditor himself has a lot of different challenges. We're expected to handle the complexity of the new way that your company may be progressing in its use of technology. Technology itself is getting more complex. The applications of technology are getting more complex in order to, build businesses and provide customers with services and products. Auditors and people responsible for the governance of the environment need to be more efficient. They need to provide an increasing level of assurance over those processes. But given the traditional models and the traditional way this is done, this is becoming more and more of an impossible process to do with the method that is traditionally practiced. So we need to talk about ways that we can integrate governance with the process of design, development, and deployment. Today, governance is integrated into the code. As we look at the way that we're changing everything to be as code, security as code, infrastructure as code, governance as code, this also applies today here, whereby the governance structure has to be done in the code itself. Probably the most common question I get from customers when I talk to customers on a regular basis is, Chad, tell me how I can put the guardrails in. Tell me how to govern this environment. Because it's just the Wild West here in our company. People are using their credit card to spin up, to pay for and spin up cloud environments. And I just cannot keep track of everything that's going on, and let alone figure out how to put some guardrails in place that'll enable them to do what they need to do to experiment with new technologies and new services without breaking compliance rules or breaking security rules or being insecure in general. So to answer this question, we're gonna discuss a lot about that today, what that means and what governance really means today and how it's evolving. During this session, think about what won't exist in 10 years, in 5 or 10 years. What parts of the governance, risk, and compliance or auditing function won't or can't exist in 5 years?
Ooh, I have an
What?
idea.
You do? What is it?
Maybe spreadsheets.
Spreadsheets? Maybe spreadsheets will die? Yeah.
Maybe.
I think that's the same thought. Finance 10 years ago was all about spreadsheets, and now I think they're doing better. But yeah, without having spreadsheets, like having controls mapped to each other and mapped to using unified control framework, hopefully that'll be gone. But really think about what will be gone and what has to be gone. What manual processes are we doing today that cannot be done when your business is 10x what you're doing today, or the complexity of your IT is 10x or 100x of what it is today. And I'll bet as you think about it, the existing today, the governance processes you may be using and practicing in your company are either, if they're not already obsolete, they're going to be very, very quickly. So we got to think about how we're going to evolve. And I think about this a lot. As the person primarily in charge of audits and doing kind of governance functions at AWS, we're constantly trying to rethink how we're doing this. As our own services start using AWS services to deploy, we call them AWS native services, like Lambda. Lambda is a service built on AWS, not built on our own on-prem systems like S3 and EC2 is. So as we see more of that, we have to really challenge ourselves and think about it. The growth of the innovation that you see coming from AWS is pretty astounding. This is the chart of things and services, features, things that we are releasing, new security products, new features within existing products that enable security. This is the pace of innovation that AWS is providing to our customer base. And what that means for you is those working in governance, we need to go from a linear model of governance where you would be able to have the luxury of sitting down, identifying things you need to assess, performing an assessment, remediate, and then recover. I mean, how many times does this linear process happen today in your company? There's too many times it's being repeated, too many iterations, too many issues coming up. So the security lifecycle needs to mature to a point where the detect, correct, deter, and prevent process is constantly being practiced in the organization, and that it's built into the code, and that those services, those governing functions, are self-service by default and make it so you cannot in any way, unless you break all kinds of rules and they're alerted on, you can't deploy something that's non-compliant or insecure. So I'm going to pass it over to Hart to talk a little bit about the service offerings. And as he goes through these, think about that. Think about as we're progressing this function of governance and risk and compliance, think about how that can be achieved, or at least the next generation of GRC can be achieved using these services. Hart?
Cool. Hey, thanks, Chad. So we'll kind of get a little bit of a sense of the crowd here, right? When you're talking about governance, it's a vital, vital topic to discuss, but not always the one that has the most glitz and glamour, right? And so I want to get a little bit of a sense for the audience today. Who here is like a spreadsheet jockey, right? Like the way you do governance today is by lovingly handcrafting multi-tab spreadsheets and asking people to respond, right, to every cell within them, right? Do you build your own macros as part of that, right? You put in a little bit of automation, right? Maybe pre-populate a few fields, right? That's kind of the state of the art today for a lot of organizations, and the way they scale that is by sharing those spreadsheets with their business partners. Say, not only do we get the pleasure of filling those out, but why don't you fill one out for us too, right? And so it's not really a scalable mechanism. It's not really something that you're truly automating, although there are little pieces that you can make a little less painful. As Chad was saying, what we want you to do is think about today ways that we can use the cloud to protect the cloud through increased and automated governance, but also ways you can backport that to the way you do things on premise, right? A lot of this comes down to how you approach solving the problem, not strictly the technology you're using. And all the spreadsheet really is a fancy checklist. It's a fancy clipboard, right? And so we've taken that old school inspection mechanism and we put it in a different format. What we want to talk to you about today is breaking that paradigm almost entirely and thinking about how do we audit, right? How do we demonstrate compliance, and how do we build systems with change control that, as Chad said, is done in code, right? It's code native, where you're building, deploying, and operating with the same mechanisms in governance, risk, and compliance as you are to serve up that wonderful image on the front page of your website. We've got a bunch of services in AWS that are going to help you do that. I'm going to highlight just a couple of them today. I'm not trying to not love some of our services, but there's a lot of ways to approach this. The first one is CloudTrail. This is often the bread and butter of any governance strategy in AWS. What CloudTrail provides is an audit log of what your users are doing from the perspective of identity and access control. So who accessed what service, when, and from where? Essentially what CloudTrail tells you. It's very quick. It has a high degree of detail in it. And so you can really parse that log in a variety of ways to understand what people are doing in the system you want to govern. Then you say, well, now that I understand the environment, how do I want to think about establishing those guardrails, right, at a basic level, what will work and what won't work? And a lot of our customers go directly to config rules. It's a way to codify some of these guardrails that Chad was referring to in a scalable way, right? You can not only develop them centrally and push them out to the organization, but you can encourage the individual dev teams to develop their own config rules and ship them with the application or the workload when they're deploying. Right? Guard Duty is fantastic. It's something we launched about a year ago, maybe a little less. And what it allows us to do in AWS is expose to you threat intelligence, intrusion detection data, so that you can consume that and make risk-based decisions on how you want to govern your environment from an operational standpoint, right? You can really look at what's going on in the environment, how are we exposing some of this information to you about what we're seeing, right? And make changes maybe to those guardrails, maybe think about how your policies are affecting your implementation. Could be that there's not actually an adversary that's causing you the issue. It's you have a bad policy and people are trying to comply with it, and that's forcing them to make suboptimal decisions in operations, and that's resulting in performance that you don't want to see. And so sometimes when you look at Guard Duty Day, for instance, it's not an adversary that's out to get you, right? It's the reformation or the improvement of a policy that's going to really get you the right result. CloudWatch is the Swiss Army knife of logging data. So I talked a second ago about linking Guard Duty not just to governance, but to operations, right? And an important aspect of governance that I think we can all agree on is that if you're governing something well, a primary result of that is that you're operating it well, right? You're not just compliant, but you're operating the system in an effective manner at scale. And so what CloudWatch allows you to do is begin to factor in some of that operations telemetry and how you're thinking about your governance regime, right? So you can look at CPU, you can look at memory, you can look at a variety of bits of data, and then you can also import other data sources into CloudWatch to give you a common operating picture that can inform your governance process. Where do we see customers using that quite a bit today? When you're thinking about change management. You want to file a CM ticket and make a substantial change. One of the things you need to be looking at is, of course, CloudTrail and Guard Duty and all the rest of it, but that's going to live from were we successful in that CM in the CloudWatch domain, right? Another service that recently went GA, I think yesterday, is Security Hub, right? And so who's familiar with Security Hub? All right, as a governance specialist, as somebody who's fanatical about this stuff, Security Hub is your best friend, right? This is a space where we can expose to you not only what's going on in your environment, so instead of having to look at each individual service and how it's performing from a security standpoint, like it implies, it's a hub where you can go one centralized location. It also allows you to conduct automated checks against certain compliance regimes and also develop some of your own, right? And so it's a great first place to look if you want to get that overall view of how things are going from a security and governance standpoint. Another one I want to highlight today is Control Tower, right? This is another one I'm really excited about. It also went in GA recently, I think yesterday or today. We've had so much excitement here. I'll be honest, I'm not sure what happened today versus yesterday. I think today's Wednesday still, maybe. Control Tower is fantastic in that there's a lot of customers who are really comfortable with building, deploying, and operating guardrails as part of their development pipeline. And that's fantastic if you're able to do that on your own today and you can do that at scale. We've got many customers, though, who say, if you already know what the basic guardrails should look like, why can't we just have them baked in from the start? Why can't we centrally govern them? Why do we have to have every dev team develop their own? And so Control Tower is this really fantastic way to launch new environments with the guardrails baked in, right? They're already ready to go. And then you can load your workloads in on top of that and continue to develop, right, in that environment. The last service I want to talk about today in this context is Lambda, right? What Lambda allows you to do is really auto-remediate, right? All of these things you're going to find as you're traversing the environment, using the telemetry and the services I just talked about, and want to make changes, right? Too often, the environment we're in from a governance standpoint is we have a long list of things that we want to address, but not enough time to address them because we got to go audit the next system, right? And so you never quite circle back around to really, at a root cause level, remediating what the problems are. And so Lambda being a Swiss Army knife that gives you this ability to remediate in an automagical way, right? What you can do is you can develop a series of event-driven responses so that when you see something in Security Hub, when you see something in Guard Duty or CloudWatch or Config Rule, you can have a prescribed set of actions that occur. It can be as simple as alerting a developer, right, based on some of the information you find in the runtime environment, the instance metadata. Or it could be something a little more dramatic, like changing a security rule back to the way it's supposed to be, right? Or updating a policy, or switching out an IAM policy for a different one, right? So there's a lot of things you can do in this space for auto remediation. All right. So with that as a background, what I'd like to introduce to you is Jason Cao. He's Director of Security at Fidelity. And he's going to talk to you about a couple of the ways that his team has implemented automated governance at scale. And then we're going to have a chance to ask him a few questions. Jason, come on up. Cool. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Hello, my name is Jason Cao. I'm a Director of Security Architecture at Fidelity Investments. And I'm here to talk to you about how we do compliance at scale. First off, the pursuit of compliance. How do we achieve this? And here, I want to shock you guys a little bit because identity and access management permissions are not the same as security policies. Our security policies are much more complex. They're basically a combination of different things, including identity and access management. We use infrastructure as code. We use CloudFormation heavily at Fidelity Investments. And we use a few other things, right, using some logging telemetry. And we have a suite of security controls, which include preventative, detective, and remediation controls in our environments. So how do we achieve compliance at scale? I'd like to share with you an example that is very near and dear to my heart. So some of my colleagues in the crowd know this and have worked on this with me. One of the things that we're very passionate about is some of our network constructs at Fidelity. So a couple months ago, actually almost a year ago, when some team wanted to come to us and work on security groups, what they had to do is they had to submit a request to a central organization and basically ask them to change a security group or create a different rule. So for example, EC2 authorized security group egress, EC2 authorized security group ingress, create security group, things like that. And then after they come through, the central org approves it and then deploys that into an AWS environment. Guess what? Turns out that this doesn't really scale very well. It can be a little bit cumbersome and it can be slow, and we got a lot of requests. And guess what? Guess who understands networking of applications the most? It turns out it's not the central organization, but it's actually the development teams who work on these applications. So we thought about this, about how do we scale this across our organization? And then we sat down and looked at our policy and said, what's the best way to do this? So we created a suite of controls. We created detective, remediation controls, and we also created preventative controls. So we created rules in CF and NAG, which is an open source rule set built by Stelligent, and we built on top of what they've already provided and created a suite of controls that we can now put in our pipelines. So what we did after that was we released these permissions back to the developers for a self-service experience. So now in the pipeline in the middle, you can see the developer will actually have those permissions. They scan their CloudFormation templates, they see what's compliant, what's not, and then they're able to deploy that into our end environments, which is great. This is a more self-service model that we got to. The last pipeline on the page is for specific examples where we have very specific use cases where we can even make this a better model of compliance. And with that, I want to talk about AWS Service Catalog. With some of our use cases, we use AWS Service Catalog to abstract away IAM permissions. In this example here, we use SageMaker, which is an ML service provided at Amazon. And we use this for our data scientists. And one of the things that we require is that we require direct internet access to be disabled, and we require direct or root access to the machine to be disabled as well. By default, when you spin up a SageMaker instance, these are enabled by default today. So this doesn't quite meet our rigorous security policy. So with Service Catalog, what we can do is we actually do not give out those IAM permissions to the end user, and we can actually have these data scientists go through this pipeline, and that's the only way they can deploy a SageMaker instance, and they will never have these end IAM permissions. So I want to go back to the security example we talked about earlier. This has actually happened a few days ago this weekend. A couple of us in the audience were on an email chain where a development group actually emailed us and asked us, how do I make my security groups in lower environments, so for example, sandbox and also development environments, how can I make these more secure? And when I saw this, I was in my office and I almost jumped out of my chair for this, because what this means, this is a fundamental shift in how people think. Because now we have development teams who are now proactively trying to do the right thing and trying to build security into their application components. And this is a shift that we're very excited about, and we're all, I think it really shows the shift of responsibility and shows that shared responsibility model we have of now how security is everyone's responsibility.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Jason. Appreciate that. So
Sure.
while we've got you here, thank you. If it's all right, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. That story you tell about your experience this weekend is super compelling to me, right? Because it tells two things. One is you've been able to effectively decentralize some of the governance.
Yes.
And at the same time, you've brought people to the table. You've got developers interested in governance, which is kind of sexy, right? And so my first question to you is, how do you get buy-in from your peers, right, to go from this highly centralized model you started at in the financial institution to a more decentralized model you're operating in today?
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen is as we build more tooling, we build more automation about these controls, right? Building the right detective, building the right preventive controls, the right remediation controls, and building the right set of the framework for developers to operate in. We actually create a more frictionless environment, which allows developers to more think for themselves and push what they really want to do and move at faster scale, right? And what this does, it makes it a frictionless experience. And we've actually seen cases where developers come to us suggesting better security rules, better security posture, and they contribute back into this decentralized security environment.
Oh, that's super awesome. So you get this kind of accretive value, right? People take pride in ownership. You're extending the shared responsibility model.
Yes.
Right? And then you have this opportunity to have some of your really bright developers contribute novel ways of solving the problem that just benefits the rest of the organization, right?
Definitely.
That's super cool. The other thing that's really interesting to me about what you talked about is you didn't use the word spreadsheet once.
I don't know what a spreadsheet is.
Yeah, you didn't use that once, which I think is fantastic. But at the same time, I think that kind of means that the people you're working with and the people you're looking to hire in the future probably have a different skill set than the governance folks you looked for in the past. What makes an ideal team member for you today?
So I went back and forth on this with some of my colleagues earlier today about how do we build the right teams? How do we build good teams at Fidelity? And one of the things that stuck out to us is I know AWS always pushes new features, changes things, and produces new things of value. One of the things we really look for is developers or engineers who are willing to go that extra mile. They're able to dig down and really find things that can possibly impact our security posture at Fidelity. And they can dive down in the details and truly understand the true impact of what these services bring to Fidelity.
Super awesome. Super awesome. So you said engineer in there a few times. I want to be clear. There's a role for engineers in governance, right?
Correct.
But there's also a role for people who are compliance specialists and auditors. How do you think about the skill set for them? How are you incorporating them into what you're doing?
We incorporate them because I think one of the good things that we've had is we've had a lot of collaboration. So we've had these auditors, we've had these engineers kind of work together to truly find out implementable policies that are going to help developers get their job done, but also keep Fidelity secure. And that's what's beautiful about that collaboration that we see.
I love it. And the word implementable is just so key here, right? It's absolutely crucial. And so the last question I'd want to ask while you're up here is, this sounds like an awesome thing you've done over the last year, few months. What's in store for us in 2020 at Fidelity?
What's next? So we're never done with our journey as we continue to develop, migrate more things in cloud and develop more. We face the scaling issue, right? So we always look at how do we automate more, how do we kind of build up our framework of detective remediation, preventive controls, and kind of help build more self-service options to enable a more frictionless experience for all parties involved.
Oh, that is super cool. Yeah, particularly, the self-service thing, it is, what brings everybody to the table and allows them to do their job in a way that they can focus on the outcome and not necessarily the governance, and the whole time they're being governed effectively, right?
Yeah.
That's super cool. Hey, thanks a lot for being with us today, man. Thanks, Jason. Super cool. Awesome. So Jason painted a picture of what they're doing today, which I think is fantastic. But one of the challenges Chad set out for us at the beginning of this session is to think about the art of the possible, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, in this next case study, nerdvana, right? This kind of idea where you can put together a bunch of the pieces of the story you've heard today in an infrastructure as code-driven manner. There are some customers who are doing all this at various levels of maturity, but often we have customers focusing in on one particular area and developing some competence and expertise, and then they're thinking, well, if I can do that this year, what am I going to do next year, right? And so we'll get into a little bit of the nerdvana case study. So if you think about infrastructure as code, you've got to have a software supply chain, right? You have to have something that allows you to design, build, deploy, and operate what it is you're going to have working in the cloud. And today, that can be in a couple of different modalities. I'm going to zoom in on one area, which is this idea of using pipelines and DevOps teams to drive governance and to drive the development of infrastructure. But it's not the only way you can do it, right? And so I'm going to tell you a little story. Who here today develops a threat model with every application that they design or deploy? Well, first of all, we got to get that number way up in the future, right? So that's homework assignment number one. We have to think more deeply about threat modeling. The format doesn't matter. The tooling to develop it doesn't matter. We've got some great partners that can help you threat model, right? Whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. But the point is, what a threat model does from a governance standpoint is help prioritize what's important. When you've got a checklist a mile long, you've got a spreadsheet with 24 lovingly crafted tabs in it, you have to tell the developers what to focus on in the sprint this week. Like, what am I going to build this week? And then what am I going to build next week, and the week after that, and the week after that, until we're kind of feature complete from a governance standpoint. And a threat model is a great way to do that, and I'll tell you why. If you develop a threat model well, it doesn't have to be beautiful or perfect, but if you develop it well and check it into the code repository, which all of the other code in your environment is going to live in, it allows you to then look at that and say, what are the user stories I need to create that either mitigate one of the threats I'm concerned about or prevent us from developing a system that creates a scenario where this bad thing could occur, right? I can then take that user story and go off and build something, right? Now when I'm ready to test to see if it's valid, I go back to that threat model and I say, what's the unit test, the security unit test, that ensures that the code I just wrote is going to be effective in mitigating the threat I'm concerned about, right? And so now, if it passes the test, I can promote that to the next stage in the process. I can go to dev to test, test to P-1 or integration to production, right, whatever it might be. And then I can trigger some monitoring, right? We can CloudWatch, we can have vulnerability scanning, we can have third-party pen tests, right? And then we can take that information and feed it back to update the threat model, right? And so not only do you have test-driven development, but now you've got user stories that are driven by a governance or a security point of view, right? That works equally well with other aspects of governance. Today we've been talking a lot, I think implicitly, about security, right? But you can do the same thing from a cost standpoint if you want to optimize for cost in your environment. Some of our customers say, we need to bundle a cost governance model or a change control governance model along with ensuring we have the right guardrails in place, right? So that's one thing that you can do using a pipeline that's really interesting and fits right into the developer's workflow. So kind of like Jason was talking about, you build the right frameworks that allow them to do it self-service and bring them to the conversation. This is a model of governance they will understand. When you bring them the spreadsheet, they're like, does not compute. Right? You're like, hey, I need you to write me a user story that allows us to do this governance function, and then I want you to show me the evidence from the unit test. They go, no problem, we'll do that in the next sprint. Totally get it, right? So you got to kind of weave that in. So that's one thing. The other thing that you can do is shift your model of how you're thinking about the evidentiary portions of governance, right? And so today, as Chad was saying, often that's some sort of audit log spreadsheet. You go in, you sample some things, right? Decide how big of a sample size is statistically significant to feel comfortable with the controls that you have in place, right? Which is an all right method of doing things. If you're using a pipeline and you're taking the approach that we're kind of suggesting today, one of the cool things about this is that the pipeline itself, that software supply chain, is going to emit a lot of the evidence you need to know if your controls are, first of all, in existence, and second of all, if they're effective, right? And then third of all, in operations, how are they performing, right? And you can do that seamlessly with that chain of custody, right? And the ability to walk back the provenance and pedigree of what drove that outcome, right? Which developer checked in which code that got which effect, which test passed or failed, right? And you can kind of see that end to end from a governance standpoint. And you can slice and dice that a few different ways. You can ask questions about cost. You can ask questions about change management, right? You can ask questions about identity, span of control, right? A bunch of things. So that's one way of looking at this, is as a pipeline. And I want you to walk away with kind of two ideas. The first is that you want to create a feedback loop from a governance perspective where you're identifying the things that are most important and helping the team prioritize the work to ensure that you have a high integrity, highly scalable system that has the right guardrails in place, right? And that you can trace that back, and when you get to the end, you can take that lessons learned and feed it right back in to update the threat model or write a new user story to go and sprint again, right? MVP and iterate. The second thing I'd like you to take away is that the supply chain itself is a critical component of the evidence you need to be effective at governance at scale. I'll say in the cloud, but really anywhere, right? I mean, you want to go right to the supply chain to kind of get that and not worry about sampling things in the runtime environment, right? So this is a great way of thinking about it. Some of you may, like I said, already be approaching components of this today, right? But if you're not, right, it's something to think about. It's a bit of nerdvana. But we have folks who are doing this to varying degrees and really benefiting from it from a governance, risk compliance, and also security engineering standpoint. The other way to look at this, same story, is from the perspective of, well, what if I'm not doing the whole DevOpsy agile thing, or I'm not doing it consistently across the enterprise, but we've got workloads that we want to make sure are governed in a particular way. Are there AWS services to help? Earlier, we talked about a number of services that had a lot to do with the telemetry, right? And then the auto remediation. I'm going to highlight a couple of services now that do some of the same things I just talked about, but do it from a service-specific level. So for example, Jason touched on Service Catalog, right? That's a phenomenal way to govern in an enterprise the types of workloads and how they're deployed, and whether or not they have the right identity, whether they have the right guardrails in from the get-go. And what's cool about Service Catalog is, although it has an API, which is fantastic, it also literally has push-button deployment. So people, just like if you think of an ITSM Service Catalog, you can go in and say, I need a 3-tiered web application that roughly does this with these controls. And you go, oh, there it is, deploy. Right? And if you have the permissions in Service Catalog as a program manager or as an auditor or as a developer to do that, then you can do that. And if not, right, then you have a means of going to say, well, why don't I have access to this? Let me go find out. There's a governance rule that's appropriate here, and go work through that. So Service Catalog is a great way at enterprise scale to take some of the things I was doing and not only give you the API, but also literally give you the easy button, right, to deploy a highly governed, compliant system by default. Another one is AWS Systems Manager and Ops Center, right? This is a way to take some of that operational data that I was referring to earlier and really driving it into the governance and compliance program by adding not only the guardrails, but the ability to create remediation and response documentation, right, that goes along with it. And so if you're managing a help desk, if you're looking at escalations or remediating audit finding, it's a great tool to use. Another tool that I think the governance community doesn't spend enough time thinking about is our well-architected framework and the well-architected tooling. Right? Let's say there's a bunch of you out in the audience, because I saw many of you, and you said, I don't threat model today, and it seems like it's going to be really hard to build the competency and the capability around threat modeling. Start with well-architected. Right? We have a service available to you that has a security pillar with some of the foundational and fundamental security risk compliance requirements that you ought to be considering for your systems. Right? And there's an API. Right? And so right out of the gate, if you say, I don't know what's important, start with the well-architected framework, start with the well-architected tool, do self-assessments, use the API to compare improvement over time, right? And drive change in your organization from that get-go, developing the user stories, right? Doing the builds, all the rest of it. The last one I want to highlight right here is CloudFormation. All right? One of the things that I will often do when I'm working with the compliance and audit teams and our customers, and I'll do it a little cheekily, but I'll slide a CloudFormation template across the table and say, what do you think? And often they'll kind of look at it and they go, I don't know. It's, I guess, some code or something. Must be important if you passed it over to me. All right? I'm not saying the community has to be a bunch of developers. But you heard today the theme was automation, API-oriented, service orientation, right? And the nice thing about languages like that CloudFormation uses is that they're basically human readable. If you spend a few minutes kind of reading through it, even without being a developer, you can kind of figure out, well, this means this, and this is where we apply this policy, and ooh, star.star, that's probably not good, right? And you can sort of figure out what's going on. I would really encourage you in the governance community to think about CloudFormation. And when I asked that question earlier about who writes their own macros to develop some of the automation in your spreadsheets, CloudFormation and Lambda need to be your weapon of choice for governance, risk, and compliance in the future. It's not hard. It takes just a little bit of time to get comfortable with. But it's going to open up the world to you in terms of your effectiveness and your ability to partner with teams like Jason's, right, to be able to decentralize what you're doing as a governance function, but more importantly, to be able to have an assured point of view, to know what's being done where and to be able to interpret the evidence that's being provided to you, right, to be comfortable with what's going on. So the last thing I want to share with you on this topic is just a simple example of how you can bring a number of data points together across AWS using Lambda to auto-remediate, right? And so this is a pretty common pattern you see on the board here, where we're ingesting CloudTrail, we're ingesting VPC flow logs, we're using a WAF, we have a shield for anti-DDoS, we're using guard duty for threat intelligence, we've got AWS config providing a series of guardrails as well as some feedback on how those guardrails are being applied, we're pumping that into CloudWatch, and then we're using events from all of those data sources to make decisions about how we want to govern the environment, right? So that's the alerting, the remediation. We're having pre-programmed countermeasures, particularly if you have something that's behaving in an unusual manner, you might want to quarantine that off for additional investigation and forensic analysis, right? And so we have this ability without a whole lot of effort, right, to really bring all of this together and create an environment that begins to automate the governance of it and allows you, as a person who's passionate about governance, to move up the stack to higher order issues that are going to impact your business in a positive way because you know those guardrails are in place. You know the data is being analyzed, and you know the right mechanisms are there to alert and escalate when needed, right? So that's one version of Nerdvana for the governance space. I'm sure there are others, but it's definitely something to think about. Right? And so now what we want to do is actually take you even further than that and talk about how we can use math and science to elevate the level of assurance you might have in these types of systems that I'm talking about. And so Chad and Reema are going to talk about that a little bit.
Thank you, Hart. So before we talk about more math and automated reasoning, I think from this presentation, I think it's clear what the future of the GRC function is. And that is that it's very small, decentralized, and that the tools that the entire engineering or architect environment have, the teams in your environment have the things they need to deploy securely and in a compliant way. You know, what Jason was talking about and Hart calling a very sexy compliance function, the sexiest compliance function is a very tiny compliance function, and a compliance function that has a lot of technical ability and knows what those guardrails are and how to evidence those to auditors, how to evidence how the controls are designed and how they're operating to those who need to, like the external independent auditors. So I would just say, like, as you think about it and as you go back, can I have a raise of hand? Who here is a dedicated GRC function in your company? Okay, so there's some, but there's not a lot. And I would totally expect that, because what's happening here at this conference is a lot of very technical people trying to understand how to bring this governance into their design. And so I would say, for those of you who are in the GRC function, this is an invitation to get more technical, to really understand how to create these guardrails, and then partner with the technical teams. The technical teams have to go back and kind of push from your side, push the CloudFormation template example of pushing that across the table and saying, what do you think of this? That's a good way to get the traditional audit folks to really start thinking about this from a compliance as code and security as code aspect. One of the other things that we're doing here in AWS is really exploring what automated reasoning can do for us in the compliance world. Automated reasoning, and we have Reema here who will come up and talk more about this, but automated reasoning in using mathematical proofs to prove a system characteristic, a condition of the system, such as strong encryption keys, or such as extensibility of the network, whether or not a network has access to the internet anywhere defined in any node or any policy in the entire network. These, to understand a condition or a characteristic of a system is a much better way to audit it than doing a population sampling method or a manual, any kind of manual control, or even an interview. Because many times when an audit team doesn't know technically what's going on, they resort completely to an interview to understand, document, and test controls. So I would say, as we move to something more advanced, such as using mathematical proofs to give a very, very high level of assurance that yes, encryption keys of 256-bit or greater are used in the system, that is going to be the only way for in some cases, to prove or at least get a high level assurance over a very, very complex system. So with that, I'd like to invite Reema up. Come on up, Reema. And I guess we'll just stand here, or? Okay. Reema, why don't you, do you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Reema Tanish. I am a security engineer with AWS Security Hub. And just a little background about myself. Back in 2011, I worked as a system auditor for the Inspector General for GSA. And I remember back then, things were pretty manual, right? Like, we did a lot of manual system testing, inspections of system logs. Although also we built pen testing procedures. And many of you may know that these could be really complicated, right, and expensive, especially when you were testing production systems. And one of the other things that I wanted to also mention is that GSA was the first government agency at that time to adopt cloud technologies. So when we had to do audit for cloud-based systems, it wasn't really clear, right? Like, how do you do that? How do you take principles and testing procedures for on-prem systems and apply them to the cloud environment? So it wasn't really clear. But I'd say before I left, things had changed quite a bit. So that's just a bit of my background as it relates to this topic.
Great. What are you working on now at AWS?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I am a security engineer working on AWS Security Hub. And Security Hub just GA'd actually this week, as Hart mentioned. For those of you who are not familiar with the service, Security Hub gives you a common place to view your compliance status and your highest priority alerts across all of your AWS accounts. So interestingly, I have been recently focused on a functionality in AWS Security Hub that automates checking for compliance. So that's been my recent focus at Security Hub.
Okay. And how does that, I mean, what is the general value proposition to customers there? Like, how is it benefiting customers, the work you're doing there?
Yeah. So, so customers that we talked to in the past told us that they have a really huge backlog of compliance requirements. And some of our financial institution customers have like hundreds of compliance checks in their backlog that they really wanted to build, right? But they didn't have the enough resources or time. And further, when you look at these compliance standards like PCI, CIS, and so many, it takes some time to try and figure out how do they map and how do they translate to a cloud environment. So at Security Hub, the first compliance standard that we rolled out is the CIS benchmark, and we're planning to add more. So the CIS benchmark in Security Hub consists currently of 43 fully automated compliance checks that are constantly checking across related resources in your account and giving you this compliance status, right? Now, the other feature that is also available in the compliance standard is that let me actually go back. So once these checks are ran, the results are called findings. So like if you go in Security Hub, you will see there's like a list of finding in the compliance section. So for each finding, you will also receive a status of the compliance for that resource, as well as steps that can help you remediate. Right? So you can follow these steps and try to figure out how to resolve this issue. The other nice thing is Security Hub is fully integrated with CloudWatch events. So what does that mean? That means that now customers have ability to build custom automation, like Hart was talking about Lambda and step functions. So through CloudWatch events, you can now route these findings and build some logic in a Lambda function or a step function, or even third-party solutions. So you can build some automation logic to resolve and remediate your compliance findings.
And we've tested that we've beta customers trying that, and what has their general response been to those features?
Yeah, so we actually worked with a control group, focus group customers. We've also been in preview since last year, Inforce. And we received a lot of great feedback from our customers. We also received a lot of feature requests that we worked on between then and now before we went GA. So we're really fortunate to have all that feedback from our customers.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with automated reasoning, kind of your work there and
Sure.
the team's work?
Yeah, so AWS has a number of automated reasoning technologies available that are integrated in a number of AWS services. So, these services help our customer check for compliance. So I'm going to talk about two of the tools that are available. One of the tools which we refer to internally as Zelkova is an access management, well, it's access control, really, governance tool. And what this tool helps you do is kind of check properties of IAM and resource policies, and it would tell you, whether some property exists or not. So I'm going to give you some examples. The particular tool is currently integrated with AWS S3 buckets. So you might have noticed if you go to the S3 console, there is actually a column that tells you and alerts you if an S3 bucket is allowing an unauthorized access to some user. So it will alert you that there is an unauthorized user that can read or write to your bucket. So that is actually powered by an automated reasoning tool that uses math and logic. The other prominent also service at AWS that is using the same technology for access control verification is AWS Config. So currently, AWS Config offers 8 managed rules that customer can use to do more specific checks that are targeted at S3. There's some other integration also, but I'm just going to mention these. The other automated reasoning tool that is also available that deals more with network configuration is internally called Tiros, but kind of known as a feature in Amazon Inspector. It is the network reachability rules package. So you have the ability to go into Amazon Inspector and run an assessment. And what these rules do, they automate monitoring your AWS network and assess if there is an access to your EC2 that's misconfigured, right? It also gives you some guidance as to how you can, figure out, fix these issues. But what I really like about Tiros is that there is no pen testing, right? It's packetless. You're not throwing any testing any networks. Really using packets, which makes it really manageable and not expensive. Also, you don't need to install any scanners. So that's really great about using these Tiros and the other tools. They're really seamlessly built in.
I know we have a website that talks more about this. I mean, actually, there are a lot of sessions that we have had at Reinforce about automated reasoning, and I'm going to recommend a couple in a minute, but I think it's something to really seriously think about, how automated reasoning can be used to provide a much higher level of security and a much higher level of assurance than doing traditional testing, pen testing, or scanning, things like that. So go here to learn more about provable security, and then also there's some related breakouts that we have here around both provable security and some other things around using the services and tools that we've just described to talk more about, in your environment to do better governance, risk, and compliance. Okay, I think that's it. All we have time for, and thank you all for coming. and have a great rest of the conference.